The 6th of October 1981, Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat, at the peak of his powers, celebrating the anniversary of the 1973 war with Israel. With all eyes turned towards the military parade, suddenly shots were heard. The president had been assassinated. The vice president, Hosni Mubarak, who had been sitting shoulder to shoulder with Sadat, was quickly pulled out from the chaos and escaped unharmed. Sadat's sudden demise would prove to be a pivotal point in Mubarak's career. Just 8 days later, he was elected president.
The transfer of power from Sadat to Mubarak did not happen democratically. It happened in a bureaucratic way. It was an inheritance of power.
Having ruled Egypt for 30 years, President Mubarak is now 83 years old. During his long life, he has been a witness to momentous events, both politically and socially. Yet for many of his compatriots, things have stayed the same, and Egypt remains a nation in waiting. By 1999, a time for new beginnings was approaching. A new century and a new term for President Mubarak. He had already ruled Egypt for 18 years. And throughout this time, life had been moving slowly for its people, reflecting the gentle flow of the Nile. But the mood of Egyptians was now very different to the one that had welcomed Mubarak's assumption of the presidency in 1981. With a world of free media opening up in front of them, they were finding a new, more effective release for their frustrations.
The world is changing. We are changing. Our genes are changing. Media played an important role in this. Satellite TV, the internet, the mobile phone. Life isn't the same as it used to be. You can't keep things quiet now.
Satellite channels like Al Jazeera, which was founded in 1996, were challenging traditional media in the Arab world. Governments could no longer control what people were seeing or hearing. During a trip to Qatar in 2000, Mubarak asked to visit Al Jazeera. Shocked by the small size of the operation, Mubarak said sarcastically, "All this noise from this little matchbox?" After decades of no alternative but watching government-controlled media, Egyptians were being exposed to new perspectives on the world.
We had the media revolution. No regime could stop this kind of development. What's more, governments could no longer hide the mistakes or crimes they committed.
The printed press was also changing its form. An increasing number of newspapers were published by a younger generation hungry for change and openly rejecting the old political status quo. The government allowed its critics some space during this period. Yet whenever objections were raised regarding freedom of speech, the authorities stressed that Egypt's record compared favorably to neighboring Arab countries. But some had higher aspirations.
Why compare Egypt to Syria? Why not compare it to Sweden? Or is Egypt not worthy? Or Greece? Or is Egypt not worthy? And I'm demanding all my freedoms, not just some of them. So when I ask for my rights, don't ignore me or tell me you've got bigger problems to deal with, like people starving. So what do you want me to do to get your attention? Starve?
Journalists kept pushing the boundaries to such an extent that criticizing the president became routine. Even though under the emergency laws, such criticism could result in imprisonment. Undeterred by this prospect, Abdul Halim Qandil published a collection of his most controversial articles in a book entitled Against the President.
Criticizing the president is forbidden. The president is in charge of everything. He's the head of the military, judiciary, and the police. He hires everyone from the prime minister to the lowest government official, and he has the right to have them fired. The president is everything in Egypt. He can dissolve parliament and issue rules backed by law. To be fair, if all these powers are in the hands of the president, then we must be able to criticize him.
Literary figures joined journalists in their increasing outspokenness. Ala al-Aswani, both a dentist and a novelist, had become disillusioned with life in Mubarak's Egypt and was planning to emigrate. But first, as a farewell to his homeland, he wrote a novel focusing on a Cairo apartment block called the Yaqubian Building. Through its fictional inhabitants, al-Aswani produced a scathing critique of his country. The book may have been a work of fiction, but the author stood accused by many of defaming both individuals and Egyptian society as a whole.
This happened with many great authors in the world like Balzac and Dostoevsky, who wrote about the negative aspects of their countries. But you can't then accuse them of tarnishing the image of their country. An author doesn't try to encourage tourism. Literature is supposed to show you the bad side of the good and the good side of the bad.
The novel was a huge success, and following unprecedented sales throughout the Middle East, a big-budget feature film was produced, ensuring that the story reached an even wider audience.
نكمل كلامنا لما نطلع فوق الناس بتبص علينا.
يبصوا علينا ليه؟ يبصوا على البلد اللي باظت. يبصوا على العمارات اللي كانت أحسن من عمارات أوروبا. دلوقتي بقت مسابل من فوق ومن تحت مسخ. إحنا في زمن المسخ.
Literature is about trying to make the reader believe that the story really happened. When your character is close to someone in society, people think it was intentional. For an author, this is considered success, but it caused me problems.
أنا استخرت المولى عز وجل وقلت أرشح نفسي في مجلس الشعب عن دايرة قصر النيل.
قصر النيل؟
أهلي وناسي.
أنت عارف إحنا مسمين دايرة قصر النيل في المجلس إيه يا حاج؟ حتة الجاتوه.
The issue of corruption raised by the novel rang especially true for many Egyptians. The sight of wealthy men joining Mubarak's ruling party, then becoming members of parliament and even rising to ministerial positions, started to become familiar to the Egyptian public. Some argue that such businessmen are perpetuating the very inequalities that have plagued Egyptian society for centuries.
When there's a businessman or a capitalist in a direct governing position, he not only knows the market situation before others, he creates market situations. He makes decisions that affect the market, and his companies make use of this knowledge. This happened with some ministers, even if they overtly resigned from the boards of their corporations.
But Ibrahim Kamel, a businessman and member of the ruling National Democratic Party, doesn't see any conflict of interest in this scenario.
I don't believe that businessmen entering ministries is wrong in itself. If someone's extremely successful in his own field, then there's a chance that he'll also be successful as a minister. And who else should be ministers? University professors? Why would a university professor be any better at taking decisions than a businessman?
Or, for that matter, than a president's son. In 2002, President Mubarak's youngest son, Jamal, was appointed General Secretary of the NDP's Political Bureau, the third most powerful position in the party. Many suspected he was being groomed to become the next president, establishing a Mubarak political dynasty. However, party members insist his appointment was made purely on merit.
For anyone who's close enough to know, the addition that Jamal Mubarak made to the National Democratic Party has been good. The only problem is that this young man is called Jamal Mubarak, so everyone uses their imagination and links this to ideas of inheritance. I wish we would discuss what he has done, what he's doing, and what he can do. But to be suspicious of him just because of his name, no, it's not fair at all.
But fair or not, Jamal Mubarak's influential position in the party was seen by many as a perfect illustration of the inequalities in Egyptian society, in which power is concentrated in the hands of the privileged few. And as the gap between the haves and the have-nots widened, it seemed that two nations were living side by side in Egypt. A majority which could only afford the bare necessities, and a minority living in the lap of luxury. The historic pact Egyptians had made with the government to stay politically inactive in return for economic and social stability was starting to weaken.
The Egyptian revolts when he faces economic problems. Politics don't matter to him much. If you talk to a citizen about elections, freedoms, or democracy, he won't be that interested. But if you start talking to him about increasing prices, rent, or poverty, that's when he will concentrate and start getting angry.
The Kifaya movement, created in 2004 by a group of intellectuals, took to the streets to say enough to Mubarak's presidency and no to the idea of inherited political power. Pressure was also growing from the outside. The Bush administration was causing friction in the previously smooth relationship between Egypt and the United States. Washington was calling for so-called democracy in the Middle East, including Egypt.
President Mubarak's relationship with former American presidents has generally been very good. The only president that he wasn't able to coexist with, or who he didn't have chemistry with, was in fact President George Bush Jr.
Mubarak was feeling the pressure from all sides, unable to ignore the demands of both his people and his strategic allies. In March 2005, Mubarak made a major announcement. Article 76 of the 1971 Egyptian constitution was to be revised to allow multi-candidate presidential elections for the very first time. At the time, it seemed to be a huge step forward and was almost unanimously welcomed. But the truth would soon emerge.
Contrary to what had been claimed, in reality this article was going to be amended in a way which would discourage any form of real competition for the presidency. When I realized that it wouldn't actually create any real opportunity for democratic transformation, I opposed it.
Despite the controversy generated by the announcement, the constitutional amendment went ahead. In an historic first, Egyptians were being invited to choose their next president. September 2005, and Egypt, for the first time in its history, was experiencing election fever. Many Egyptians enjoyed playing along with the performance. Candidates they only vaguely recognized were being nominated as competitors to the president. Mubarak, presented in casual clothes, was reintroduced to the people in a modern Western-influenced campaign. And even though by now he had been ruling Egypt for 24 years, Mubarak began to declare his future dreams and vision for the country. But to many Egyptians, memories of the unrealized dreams of his tenure were still fresh in their minds. Election slogans such as "Crossing into the Future" adorned billboards throughout the country, alongside Mubarak's image, which appeared to make him look much younger than his 77 years. And on the 27th of September 2005, Mubarak was duly confirmed as president for a 5th term. He was portrayed by his supporters as Egypt's first ever democratically elected president.
President Mubarak felt he had done his job after the constitutional amendments were made. He believed that the process of change should now happen naturally and gradually, without needing an elite group or political leadership to implement it.
No sooner had the formality of Mubarak's re-election occurred than Egypt's parliamentary ballots took place. With the fast-rising star Jamal Mubarak responsible for molding the NDP's election policy, members of the party were confident of securing a large majority.
وحتى بقى بالمعايير الموضوعية جدا.
Even with the interference, the vote rigging and all the illegal tactics that were resorted to, the National Democratic Party only gained around 23% of the votes, meaning that had the voters been left to their own devices, the party would have done much worse. I can say from a truly objective perspective that the NDP is not at all popular.
This unpopularity was brought home by the elections when candidates from the banned Muslim Brotherhood group, standing as independents, won an historic 88 seats. For them, it was a significant achievement in the decades-long battle with the Egyptian government since their organization's founding in 1928.
The relationship between Mubarak's regime and the Muslim Brotherhood started quite leniently. However, by the 90s, we were back again to being pursued and sentenced in military tribunals.
The movement arose in the small city of Ismailia, but it soon spread despite facing regular crackdowns. By 2005, its message struck a chord with many of Egypt's devout, who for centuries have turned more towards religion in times of need. Some look to the Muslim Brotherhood in a desperate plea for any form of political change, having lost faith in a regime which failed to offer them a better life. Even some Coptic Christians, a religious minority in Egypt, began to vote for them.
Some Copts said that they felt closer to the Muslim Brotherhood than to the current regime. They felt that they weren't given any rights anyway, and they chose to give the group a chance, certain that they would never be as oppressive as the current government.
And yet, with the announcement of the 2005 elections, some Egyptians dared to dream that things may finally change. However, such hopes were extinguished before the year was out, as hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood members were arrested. Meanwhile, Ayman Noor, who had come a distant second to Mubarak in the presidential elections after securing 500,000 votes, also languished in jail after being accused of fraud.
This is the problem with the government in Egypt. They think that if they put a silencer on the murder weapon, then they are not murderers, as long as people do not hear any noise. And they use any legal charge or court case as the silencer.
But it's more difficult to silence those who hear the court cases. And when a group of judges staged a demonstration in downtown Cairo over government attempts to control their judicial authority, they roused huge support amongst the Egyptian people. The authorities reacted swiftly. The protests were brutally suppressed.
There are 1.7 million people working for the Interior Ministry, 850,000 officers and soldiers, 450,000 state security forces, 400,000 secret police. So there's a policeman for every 37 citizens. This is a president who's relying on an internal army in addition to the army itself. This isn't a gentle power, it's an aggressive one.
And yet, despite the best efforts of all the president's men, protests continued to erupt. By late 2006, another group was taking the lead as laborers held demonstrations against falling standards of living.
People are no longer able to make do, even though they used to manage, somehow. But the uprising by groups like the laborers, who aren't known to protest and who are normally very scared of the police, showed that something has happened which has made them overcome their fear.
In December 2006, one of the largest demonstrations took place in Mahalla, north of Cairo. 35,000 laborers stormed the Ghazal Mahalla factory, halting production at one of the largest textile producers in Egypt. The protesters insisted that they would not return to work until they received pay rises. In a rare success for the common man in Egypt, their employers, the government, eventually gave in to their demands. Labor disputes soon spread across the country, with support swelling among the Egyptian public, who were hearing their own problems being voiced. The mood was infectious. Protests are no longer restricted to the laborers. Disgruntled government employees have also stood up to the system.
The barrier of fear was destroyed. I think the credit mainly goes to the independent media, whether television or printed press. These played a vital role in getting the Egyptians to overcome their fears.
The growing popularity of electronic media was making life more difficult for the government censors.
Blogs offered the opportunity to give voice to the voiceless. At the beginning, they were only reaching people who had access to the internet. But it all expanded after that, and bloggers were able to influence public opinion and to force traditional media to report on the news they published.
Alongside new media, a more conventional art form was joining the battle. Historically, Egyptian cinema had provided a release for the masses, and its influence had spread throughout the region. But in 2007, the tone changed when director Khalid Youssef released two major films, Until Things Get Better and It's Chaos. The first revealed the harsh reality of life in Cairo's shanty towns. The second film was inspired by scandalous cases of police abuse, personified in the film by a sadistic and mentally ill police officer. Both films were instant hits.
The two films complement and complete each other. Life in Egypt has become very arbitrary. Our way of thinking and of taking political decisions has become random. Success and failure have become random. Even death has become random. People are walking the streets with no real direction or purpose. What we're addressing is the randomness that we're living in, which could be the beginning of chaos.
These fictional scenes were soon to be mirrored by real events in the streets of Egypt. In April 2008, rioters marched in Mahalla, the same Nile Delta city which had been the setting for the largest labor demonstrations just over a year before. This time, defiance reached a new level, and it was chaos. Security forces attacked and arrested dozens of demonstrators, many of whom weren't even born when Mubarak came to power.
Young people are really starting to lose hope. Their loyalty toward their country has been shaken because they have no guarantees of what will happen after they struggle with their studies and graduate. They don't know how they will live, if they will find a job, how much they will earn, if they will be able to afford to get married or buy a flat.
An increasing number of Egyptians are risking their lives as they escape their country as illegal immigrants. Some are even heading to Israel, once its greatest enemy, as a sign of anger towards their homeland, which can no longer provide for them. For many of those who remain, living standards continue to deteriorate. The main concern now is their daily bread. Even that has become hard to come by.
So many Egyptian writers, journalists, intellectuals think that a revolution is around the corner. I don't adhere to this view. I think the Egyptian people are very slow to revolt. They are not a revolutionary nation at all.
Meanwhile, President Mubarak drifts serenely into old age, spending many of his days in the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh, leaving behind him all the problems of the capital, the noise, the crowds, and the Egyptian people themselves. But he presides over a country that bears little resemblance to the one he was born in more than 80 years ago.
We encourage criticism in this society as we strive for democracy. I personally raised with President Mubarak the issue of the red line some journalists have crossed, and he assured me that reform will come with experience and that none of them would be imprisoned while he is in rule.
The reality turned out to be rather different. Prison sentences were recently handed out to 4 editors of independent newspapers for speculating on the health of the president. His well-being has become a topic of interest amongst the Egyptian public ever since they watched their president faint during a session of parliament in November 2003. Yet even at 80 years old, Mubarak is still being portrayed by government media as forever young, forever healthy, seemingly immune to the forces of nature. The president's health has become a matter of deep importance for the stability of the state.
What's really sad is that Egypt is so weak that the illness of its president can shake its economy. So how can this media machine of theirs be talking to us about stability and continuity, constitutional organizations and legal systems? Can it all disappear just like that, in a cloud of smoke? I truly believe that the worst thing which came out of this is the government admitting that if the president disappears or falls ill, then the state will collapse.
The truth is, nobody is sure what will happen to Egypt once Mubarak is gone. The question is increasingly being asked, but the answers are few and far between. And as they have done throughout the ages, Egyptians are just waiting.